In the small, tight-knit community of Harperville, where everyone knew each other's names and doors were always left unlocked, the unthinkable happened. Jacqueline Bennett, a beloved retired teacher, devoted grandmother, and the heart of her local book club, vanished without a trace. Her absence was felt instantly, but no one could predict the horrifying truth that would emerge. Days turned into a frantic search, with volunteers combing the streets, and her friends desperately reaching out. But it wasn't until a breakthrough came, a K-9 unit sniffing through Jacqueline's own backyard, that the nightmare truly began to unfold. The ground was disturbed, and what was unearthed left the community in shock. Jacqueline wasn't missing anymore. She had been found. But the discovery wasn't just a body. It was a secret buried deep, a murder hidden in plain sight. And the most chilling part? The killer wasn't a stranger, a drifter, or some faceless threat. It was someone they all knew and trusted. Pastor Samuel Grant, a man who had once stood at the pulpit, preaching love and faith, was now the man responsible for a brutal act that would forever change Harperville. But why? What pushed a respected figure of God to commit such a horrifying crime? As the details emerge, this story will take you through one of the most unsettling transformations of man you could imagine, how obsession and revenge twisted him into something unrecognizable. Stay with me, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe as we dive into this chilling case. Pastor Samuel Grant was a man whose very presence commanded attention. A charismatic preacher, he was loved by many and respected for his unwavering faith. For years, he had led his congregation, his sermons inspiring hope and strength in the hearts of those who listened. His ability to connect with people, to make them believe in the power of faith, was unmatched. He made them feel like they could face any challenge, any obstacle, with God by their side. To the outside world, Samuel was the embodiment of grace and humility, a man of God in every sense of the word. But beneath the surface, there was a different side to Samuel. His charm and powerful words were carefully crafted tools, masking a man who demanded control in every aspect of his life. Samuel didn't just want to be respected. He needed to dominate. At home, his wife, Clara, felt the weight of that control. Once, their marriage had been filled with love, respect, and a shared vision of life together. But over time, Samuel's behavior became increasingly demanding. Every decision was his to make. Every action had to be according to his will. Clara, once a woman with her own voice, now found herself walking on eggshells, unsure of how to please a man she had once loved. By early 2018, Clara had had enough. The years of emotional manipulation, the constant control, the feeling of being stifled, all became too much to bear. She filed for divorce, hoping to break free from the man who no longer allowed her to live her life on her terms. Samuel, who had built his world around the belief that his authority was unshakable, was blindsided. He saw Clara's decision not just as a betrayal, but as a personal attack. He was a man who had built his life on the foundation of power in his church, power in his home, and now that power was slipping through his fingers. The decision to divorce set off a chain of events neither Samuel nor Clara could have predicted. What should have been a civil legal matter quickly escalated into something much darker. Samuel's need to maintain control over everything in his life shifted into an obsessive desire to retain custody of their children. For him, losing the children was more than just losing a family. It was losing his last shred of power. The custody battle that followed was nothing short of brutal. Samuel Grant wasn't just fighting for his children. He was fighting for his last semblance of control. Emily, their teenage daughter, and Luke, their young son, had become the prize in a war between two people who once built a life together. Samuel didn't just want the children to be with him. He wanted to win at all costs, to prove that he could not be defeated. Even by his own family, in the courtroom, Samuel's tactics were as ruthless as they were manipulative. He painted Clara as unstable, claiming that her desire for independence made her an unfit mother. He presented her as someone who could no longer be trusted, someone whose emotions clouded her ability to care for their children. It wasn't just a legal battle. It was a full-scale character assassination. He leveraged every piece of their life together to make Clara seem like the villain, and he played the role of the victim to perfection. Clara, however, was far from defenseless. She had something Samuel couldn't control, the truth. She knew her own strength, and she wasn't going to let him tear her down without a fight. She sought support from her mother, Jacqueline Bennett, a retired teacher who was as strong as she was compassionate. Jacqueline had always been Clara's protector, the one who had stood by her side through thick and thin. Now, as the custody battle raged on, Jacqueline became more than just a source of emotional support. She became Clara's rock. While Clara fought for her children in the courtroom, Jacqueline stood with her, offering not just her voice, but her presence. Her testimony was unflinching, and it was clear that she saw through Samuel's facade. Jacqueline wasn't going to let him twist the truth or manipulate the system. She wasn't afraid to speak out against a man who had once been so revered by the community. But as the case progressed, Samuel's paranoia began to grow. He no longer saw just his wife as the enemy. Now it was Jacqueline. When he learned that Jacqueline was romantically involved with Judge Thomas Carter, the very judge overseeing the custody case, his obsession took on an even more dangerous edge. Samuel convinced himself that Jacqueline was pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating the judge to ensure his defeat. He fixated on the idea that this relationship was a direct threat to his chance of keeping the children, a betrayal he couldn't ignore. His mind twisted the facts, and his need for control became even more obsessive. He no longer saw the battle as just a fight for his family. It was a battle to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The day the custody ruling came down, it was a crushing blow for Samuel Grant. After months of bitter legal battles, arguments, and manipulation, the court ruled in favor of Clara. She was granted full custody of Emily and Luke, while Samuel was only given supervised visitation rights. It was the ultimate defeat for a man who had built his life on control and authority. His children, the one thing he thought he could never lose, were now slipping away from him, but Samuel couldn't accept it. His mind, already twisted by obsession, couldn't grasp the reality of his loss. The ruling wasn't just a legal setback. It was a personal attack. He couldn't bear the thought of his family being taken from him, especially when he believed it was all due to a conspiracy against him. In his eyes, it wasn't just Clara's decision or the judge's ruling. It was Jacqueline and Judge Carter who had orchestrated his downfall. The paranoia that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long erupted in full force. Samuel's thoughts became consumed by the belief that Jacqueline had manipulated the system, using her relationship with the judge to guarantee Clara's victory. His mind twisted every detail of the case, imagining slights and betrayals where there were none. It was as if the world had conspired against him, and his defeat was a sign of his powerlessness. With his grip on reality slipping, Samuel's obsession with Jacqueline intensified. He couldn't let go of the idea that she had played a part in destroying everything he had fought for. So he began to track her, watching her every move as if she were the key to understanding his failure. He would follow her to the grocery store, watch her leave her house, memorize her daily routines, all the while his mind churned with thoughts of revenge, and he couldn't move on from his loss. It was as if the defeat in the courtroom had fractured something deep inside him, and he could no longer function without seeking some form of retribution. His thoughts weren't about healing or rebuilding. They were consumed with the idea that Jacqueline, the woman who had stood by Clara's side, had to pay for what she had done. The obsession became all-encompassing, driving him to fixate on her every action, to turn his attention away from his children and toward the woman he blamed for his misery. November 16th. 2018, was like any other Friday evening for Jacqueline Bennett. She was preparing for her weekly book club meeting, something she had done for years without fail. Her friends expected her at 7:30 p.m., and as always, she was ready to welcome them into her home for an evening of laughter, discussion, and shared stories. But that night, Jacqueline had no idea that she was being watched, that her every move was being tracked by someone consumed by rage and obsession. Samuel Grant had spent the entire day shadowing her, lurking in the shadows of Harperville. He had no intention of letting her continue with her life unchallenged. His mind was made up. He had to confront Jacqueline, to finally face the woman he believed had destroyed him. For hours, he made sure no one else would show up. He waited. He watched, knowing that Jacqueline would be alone in her home, just as he planned. At 7:03 p.m., Samuel made his move. He approached her house, his mind still a whirl of accusations and dark thoughts. Jacqueline, who had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary, answered the door. What she saw was not the man she once knew as a trusted friend and respected figure in the community, but a man whose rage had overtaken him entirely. Samuel didn't even give her a chance to speak before forcing his way inside. He claimed he needed closure, that he had to finally hear her say what he believed she had done to him, how she had taken everything from him. But it wasn't just words that he wanted. Samuel's accusations came out in a rush, as though he had been rehearsing them in his mind for days, even weeks. He accused Jacqueline of manipulating the judge, of pulling strings behind the scenes, of working with Clara to destroy his family and reputation. But Jacqueline, ever the strong woman, refused to back down. She defended herself, stood her ground, and told him the truth, that he was the one who had destroyed his family, that his actions, his obsessions, had led to this moment. That was when Samuel snapped, in an instant. The man who had once preached about forgiveness and love became a monster. The confrontation, which had started with words, quickly turned violent. Jacqueline fought back with everything she had, scratching his face, screaming for help. But there was no one there to hear her. Samuel didn't hesitate. In his mind, Jacqueline had to be silenced. What began as a desperate argument became a brutal, uncontrollable attack. When it was over, Jacqueline lay lifeless on the floor. Samuel stood over her, breathing heavily, his hands trembling, his mind a storm of chaos and disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He hadn't planned on killing her. He just wanted to make her suffer, to make her feel the weight of what she had done to him. But now, there was no turning back. In the silence that followed, Samuel knew what he had to do next. He dragged Jacqueline's body through the back door into the cold, quiet night. With nothing but his bare hands and a garden shovel, he began to dig. The grave was shallow, hurried, a rush of desperation to hide the terrible thing he had just done. It took over an hour to cover up the body, and when he was done, the dirt and blood stained his clothes. But there was nothing more to say. He walked back inside, locked the door behind him, and disappeared into the darkness of the night. Jacqueline Bennett was gone. The following morning, Jacqueline's absence was felt immediately. Her friends, who had gathered for their usual Friday night book club, found her house dark and her car parked in the driveway. Yet there was no sign of Jacqueline. At first, they thought perhaps she had simply forgotten or had to cancel at the last minute. But as the hours ticked by, concern began to grow. Jacqueline never missed a meeting, not without letting everyone know in advance. Clara, her daughter, was the first to notice something was wrong. When calls to her mother went unanswered, panic set in. It wasn't like Jacqueline to vanish without a word. By the afternoon, Clara had filed a missing person report, and the search for her mother began in earnest. As soon as the police were alerted, the town of Harperville, normally calm and quiet, was thrown into a whirlwind of uncertainty. Volunteers combed through the streets, calling her name, while the local police launched a full-scale investigation. Something about the situation felt off. Jacqueline wasn't just a missing person. She was someone everyone knew, someone people trusted. Her disappearance shook the very foundation of the town. The search intensified with every passing hour. Officers canvassed the area, checking nearby parks, hospitals, and even the woods on the outskirts of town. It wasn't until the second day that a break in the case came. A neighbor, who had a motion-activated security camera, came forward with a critical piece of evidence. The footage showed a dark-colored car pulling up outside Jacqueline's house around 7:03 p.m. the previous evening. The car was unmistakably registered to Samuel Grant, the well-known pastor. His silhouette, though blurry, could be seen approaching the front door, the exact moment Jacqueline had last been seen alive. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Samuel Grant, the man who had been a pillar of the community, now became the prime suspect. Police had no choice but to bring him in for questioning. But it wasn't just the security footage that painted Samuel as the culprit. K-9 units were brought in to search Jacqueline's property. It wasn't long before they stopped at a patch of earth in the backyard. The dogs refused to move, their keen senses leading the officers to what would become the crime scene. The officers dug, and it didn't take long before they uncovered a shallow grave. It was hastily covered, the earth still loose, and beneath it, wrapped in a blanket, was Jacqueline's lifeless body. The discovery was devastating. Jacqueline, a woman loved by her community, had been brutally murdered and hidden in her own backyard. With this new evidence, The case quickly shifted from a missing persons investigation to a homicide case. The police could no longer ignore the mounting signs that pointed directly to Samuel Grant. His car had been near her house. His behavior, already suspicious, now appeared all too connected to Jacqueline's death. The investigation was no longer a question of finding Jacqueline. It was a race against time to prove Samuel's guilt. By the time Samuel Grant was brought in for questioning, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The police had already confirmed that his car had been seen outside Jacqueline's house on the night of her disappearance, but it didn't end there. His phone records placed him in the area at the precise time Jacqueline went missing. Samuel's alibi, once thought to be solid, was quickly falling apart. He had claimed he was at home, that he had gone to bed early, and had nothing to do with his wife's mother's disappearance. But the records told a different story. When investigators sat Samuel down, they carefully laid out the evidence. They confronted him with the security footage, the phone records, and the chilling fact that his fingerprints had been found on Jacqueline's back door handle. Samuel's face remained impassive, his jaw clenched, but the room was thick with tension. He knew he had nowhere to hide. Then there was the dirt that the forensic experts had found on the soles of his shoes. It was dirt from Jacqueline's backyard, the very ground where her body had been buried. No one had known about the shallow grave until the search dogs led them there. Samuel's own shoes had betrayed him. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Samuel Grant had been the last person to see Jacqueline alive, and he had been the one to end her life first. Samuel denied everything. He protested his innocence, insisting that he had nothing to do with Jacqueline's death. He clung to his story that he had been home that night, that he had never left his house. But as the investigators continued to lay out the facts, the weight of the evidence became too much to bear. The phone records, the footage, the fingerprints, the dirt, it all pointed directly to him. And then the turning point came. When Samuel was confronted with the security footage of his car pulling up to Jacqueline's house, and the undeniable proof of his presence at the crime scene, he fell silent. For the first time, he stopped talking. The man who had once commanded a congregation, the man who had preached about forgiveness and faith, now sat in silence, unable to offer an explanation. It was a moment of resignation. Samuel Grant, once a pillar of the community, was now caught in the web of his own lies and actions. He had no more words, no defense, and no way to deny what the evidence had already made clear. The man who had once led with authority was now powerless in the face of his own guilt. The silence that filled the room spoke louder than any denial ever could. In March 2019, the trial of Samuel Grant began, and the small town of Harperville was thrust into the spotlight. What had started as a local custody battle now became a national story, drawing attention far beyond the town's borders. The courtroom was filled with people eager to see the man who had once been a beloved pastor face justice for the brutal murder of Jacqueline Bennett. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out a clear and damning case. They presented evidence that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Samuel had planned Jacqueline's murder. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated, fueled by a burning obsession that had consumed him for months. His obsession with losing everything, with his perceived betrayal by Jacqueline the judge, had driven him to murder. Forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence found under Jacqueline's fingernails, the dirt from her backyard on Samuel's shoes, and the fingerprints found on the back door. Phone records confirmed that Samuel had been near Jacqueline's house that night, and security footage showed him at her doorstep. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man who, instead of accepting his loss, had chosen to take revenge in the most horrific way possible. As the case unfolded, it became clear just how far Samuel's mind had strayed from the man he once was. His descent into violence was methodical, and his hatred for Jacqueline and the world he thought had betrayed him only grew stronger with each passing day. Samuel had become obsessed with control, and when that control slipped away, he decided that revenge was the only way to reclaim his power. Throughout the trial, Clara, Samuel's ex-wife, sat quietly in the courtroom every day. Her face was weary, but she never once looked away from the man who had caused her so much pain. She listened as the prosecution detailed the horrific crime and the evidence that pointed directly at Samuel. Clara had already been through so much, years of emotional abuse, the custody battle, and now this trial. But this was different. This was about justice for her mother, for Jacqueline, who had stood by her side through it all. Clara refused to let Samuel's actions define her, but she knew that she had to face him one last time to ensure he was held accountable. Their children, Emily and Luke, were shielded from the gruesome details of the case. Clara couldn't bear the thought of them learning the full extent of what their father had done. They were too young to comprehend the darkness that had overtaken their once respected father. It was a decision that would haunt Clara for years to come, but she hoped it would spare them some of the pain she had endured. The trial was not just a legal battle. It was a battle for truth, for the memory of Jacqueline, and for the closure that the family needed to begin healing. But as the days passed, it became painfully clear that Samuel had chosen a path that would not lead to redemption, only to the harsh light of justice. On March 22nd, 2019, after 4 long hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom, filled with tension, waited for the final decision. When the words were spoken, it was clear that Samuel Grant's fate was sealed. There would be no chance for redemption, no hope of freedom. The man who had once been a trusted leader, a man who had stood in front of his congregation every Sunday, was now convicted of a brutal crime. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. It was the end of his career as a respected pastor, the end of the man who had once preached about forgiveness and love, only to have his own life consumed by hatred and obsession. His congregation, which had once stood by him through thick and thin, was left in shock. Some refused to believe the truth. They couldn't fathom that the man they had trusted with their spiritual well-being could be capable of such violence. Others felt utterly betrayed. They had followed a man who, in the end, had turned out to be far different from the person they had believed him to be. As for Clara, the woman who had once been married to Samuel, she found herself rebuilding her life, piece by piece. Her strength through the trial was undeniable, but it was the days after the verdict that truly tested her. With her children, Emily and Luke, Clara had to create a new world for them, one free from the man who had caused so much pain. She was determined not to let Samuel's actions define their future, and although the weight of everything that had happened was heavy, Clara refused to let it crush her. The fallout from Samuel's actions didn't stop with his family. The entire town of Harperville was left reeling. Judge Thomas Carter, who had been unknowingly pulled into Samuel's paranoia, stepped down from his position. The local church, once a place of solace and community, was abandoned. The stain of betrayal lingered in the air, and the people who had once looked to Samuel for guidance now struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Samuel's obsession with control and revenge had ultimately led to the destruction of everything he had once held dear. His crime left a permanent scar on his family, his congregation, and his community. It was a reminder of how far obsession and a desire for power could take a man, how it could twist him into something unrecognizable, capable of unimaginable harm. As we close, it's important to remember the dangers of unchecked obsession and the devastating consequences it can have. Samuel's story is a cautionary tale, one that teaches us the importance of self-control and the dangers of allowing revenge to consume us. If you believe in exposing these dark stories, sharing the truth, and raising awareness, don't forget to subscribe to riveting true crime stories. Share this video and help spread the word about the impact of obsession and how it can destroy lives.